Really interesting comments and questions coming up in the chat, so I'm going to kind of launch straight in. But first, there was something you said at the start of your talk when you were sort of deciding on your future career that kind of struck me, and I wondered if you could help me. So basically, you said, "Oh, I thought about studying plants, but I thought they were really boring, so I decided that wasn't going to be me, and I was going to do a law degree." And it was only later that you sort of realised that plants, were kind of amazing. And I sometimes find that myself. I'm a kind of from a physics, maths, chemistry, history of science kind of background, and I didn't really take biology much further, and I've never been particularly green-fingered. But every time I put on a talk about plants, or I watch a talk about plants, or I read a book about plants, or anything like that, I'm always struck by how amazing they are and how actually they're unbelievably fascinating, interesting, diverse, complex organisms in their own right. So I guess my plea to you, Beronda, is how can I change the image of plants? How can we make plants exciting and cool, and the sort of events that everyone wants to book are more interesting than kind of black holes and dark matter, which always get everyone, they're always the most popular events I put on, but no one's, but plants are here, they're interesting, yes. They're right in front of us, and they're in our lives daily. So how can I make plants exciting, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. Yes, I think, one of the responses that I think about that is the ways in which people have had an increased fascination with plants over the past year and a half during the global pandemic. And I think part of that became by them bringing them into their houses and actually being actively engaged with them. I remember, early in the pandemic, some of it was fear driven. So I had a friend who was trying to figure out how she could regrow lettuce from the lettuce scraps, or green onions from the green onions, because she was afraid we wouldn't have access to food at the market. But I think when you bring them into those spaces, it really does fascinate you in the ways of things that plants are capable of, right? Because she was fascinated that she took this little scrap of a scallion or green onion, and a couple of weeks later, she had regrown the whole thing. So I think bringing plants into spaces, one of the things that I've tried to be really actively engaged with is doing that with young children. So that you can try to get them excited about it quite early. And so one of the first experiments that I did, and I talk about this in the book, was my kindergarten teacher sent us each home with a bean, and we had to germinate that bean and see a plant grow from it. That was fascinating at the time. Of course, it was fleeting, right? Because I went on to something else. But I think that where we can actually bring plants into spaces and get people to watch them and see what they're capable of, that's the best way, is familiarity.
Excellent. And also, I think the thing for me was realizing, it was actually watching the David Attenborough Life of Plants series. Yes. Just the realization that plants are just as active and whatever as humans and animals, but they just operate on a totally different time scale. And when you see them all speeded up, like David Attenborough did in that documentary, I think that was the thing that really made me think, oh, I'm just looking at them at the wrong speed. I think that's a really important thing to get across.
That's right. Yes.
Anyway, Dina was having some interesting thoughts, which I thought I'd put to you, just kind of extending the analogy that you had sort of midway through your talk about mentoring, and about this idea of, we look at a plant that looks in trouble and we think, oh, it's the environment that must be causing the plant to be in trouble, but we don't maybe think of the same thing if we see a human that's maybe struggling. Dina says, how can we avoid the problem of the unhealthy environment wherein people thrive by being antisocial or otherwise dysfunctional? So I think it's this idea that in society you're not always rewarded, or you don't always thrive by being very social, being very giving, being very conscientious, but maybe incentives are set up for you to be selfish and you to lie and you to be mean. And I'm not, we can all have images of particular politicians or business leaders in our heads when we say these things, but but so how, I guess Dina just kind of saying, extending that analogy, how can we ensure that environments are supportive of people trying to do the right thing? And conversely, are there any problems in plants where you put a plant into a very challenging environment and that causes actually the plant to mutate or grow in a different way, or otherwise develop characteristics that we would rather it didn't?
So I think part of the answer that comes to me first, and there are many different things to think about, but I think the answer that comes to me first is that to really break out of that, the things that Dina's talking about, we have to be honest with ourselves about how we achieve success. And right now we tell ourselves that we have success individually, right? Even if when you announced me or whatever, you listed some awards I got, I never would have gotten those awards without my team, but they come in my name. And so I think that too frequently, the ways the systems are set up, we reward individual, even though the ways in which they were successful was through the collective. And our systems simply aren't designed or they aren't built to really say, well, that was a collective pursuit, so we're going to reward the collective. And so we actually then fall into the trap of believing, well, I got this award, it came in my name. And so then we start these selfish kinds of, we show up. I always show up to an accept award with my entire team, or at least parts of my team. Some of us just go on stage by ourselves and say, yeah, thank you for this award. And so I think we really have to break out of this individual success model, which really leads to selfishness and cheating, right? It leads to cheaters in the system and individual kinds of things. And those are tough conversations to have, because it means we have to change our entire reward systems and structures. But I do think it's important. And I agree, the way the systems are set up now, I often say that part of the ways I was able to write this book is because I can sit and be with myself for long hours, right? And so success in science in some ways selects for people who really are antisocial in some kinds of ways, or certainly for introverts and other kinds of individuals. And so I agree with her that sometimes our systems do seem. Now, the fascinating thing, what you said, there are certainly cheaters in nature. So I was looking at a picture the other day. I haven't seen it in person, but there's a ghost plant, which doesn't make any chlorophyll itself. It grows on other plants and other logs and just takes their sugars, right? And so there are plants in nature that are also surviving because they're selfish, but those are the rare instances of where we see success in nature. And I think, unfortunately, as humans, sometimes we set up our systems so that what's rare in nature is much more prevalent in the ways in which we've set up the ways that we select and reward who's actually doing good work. And that's something I think we need to think about.
I think that there's also an aspect of human psychology here, right? If
Yes.
me and 99 other people start very similar businesses, and my business is really successful for some kind of slight random reason, and everyone else's fails, I'll look at me and go, no, it's all down to my hard work and my brilliance at business. Whereas it could well just have been a random bit of luck and my position or whatever happens. But from my point of view, it looks all like my hard work. So I think there's also a narrative thing as well, that we like stories as humans, and we like people, and we like a story of a person doing a thing and discovering a thing, and these huge, as science operates these days in kind of big distributed research teams and international collaborations, doesn't quite map onto our human desire for this person had a clever idea and discovered this clever thing. And I wonder if also, do you think that the Nobel Prizes should be changed as well? Because I think it can only be shared between 3 people, whereas obviously now. Yes,
I think that needs to be a huge change, the ways in which we have some of those big reward awards. And even the point you were just making about, if 99 businesses start and there's one that's good. Part of that is, as you were talking, it reminded me of something I talk about frequently. We are committed to the fallacy of meritocracy. And so if we won't revisit the idea that our systems are not meritocratic, that means that we might have to admit that we got success based on luck and not our genius. And so that's where we always meet this tension of, well, of course I succeeded because I was brilliant. Well, no, there were lots of smart people and there were lots of things that aligned, but we're very hesitant to break out of that individual success and the fallacy of meritocracy, to understand how much serendipity, chance, and luck results in one of us being successful versus the other.
I'm just wondering if there's an analogy there between like an oak tree, dropping thousands of acorns and only a few of them actually end up turning into
Absolutely.
oaks.
Yeah. I was thinking a similar thing, is that when a plant drops thousands of seeds, it's a lot of luck in which one lands in a fertile environment versus which one lands on a rock. Right. And we see that play out in nature all the time. But yet we often, when we come to the human species, we excuse ourselves from the laws of nature, because we think that our intelligence and grit and wit, all of that overplays that. And the laws of nature still apply to us. So.
Although we maybe have opted out of evolution in a way, that we're changing our environment now far more than we're changing ourselves, or do you think will still be evolving? Because you can't stop evolution in that sense.
That's right.
So I'll just move on to another interesting point here. That Caroline was saying, I was listening to you from an additional or special educational needs point of view. There are currently thousands of children in the UK being home educated or receiving no education because they cannot cope with the school environment. And she asked, what would you recommend plants would you recommend schools grow in their classrooms to improve the environment and to create a more kind of mentoring?
What a great question. That is such a great question. More than specific plants that grow in environments, one of the tests that I've done here with a local elementary school in collaboration with the education professor is indeed growing some plants in the classroom, but growing them in different spaces, giving them different nutrients, different water, exposing them to different things and letting the children see how differently that they turn out depending on where they started, what they had access to, where they are physically in the environment. And I do think that there's some of the most inspiring work that I've had the privilege of doing in the past few years has been working with young people and students, not just with mentors to get them to think about being different mentors, but working with individual students to get them to understand that their performance is not always just about them, that it's often about the environment that they're in, how empowering that can be. Because in many ways, we often set students up to believe that if they're struggling, they're the problem. And that can be completely demoralizing at a time where they're still processing so much more about their space in the world. So I do think it's helpful if you can bring plants into spaces to serve as a lesson and story-based engagement for those students to understand that the outcomes they're experiencing are about them in a context, not just about what capabilities they show up with.
And actually, there's some people in the chat saying, Angelina, in fact, says, would you consider writing a book aimed at school-age children? Stories told through plants can inspire a new generation of children to look at plant life differently. So will there be a kids version of The Secret Life of Plants?
Yeah, I've been asked that a couple of times, and I haven't moved it towards an official plan, but I do, even before I wrote this book, I do work with, there are a couple of 4- and 5-year-old learning communities in my community who invite me in to talk with them about colors of leaves in the fall and different things like that. And the very last chapter opens with the story about my son and his tree that we planted for him when he was young. And he and I have had a couple of inquiries about whether we might write a children's book about that. But, he's 19, so I have to see if he actually has time to collaborate with me on a children's book or not.
Oh, hopefully. Well, I say there's definitely demand out there, so I think you'd definitely sell some copies. There's an interesting question from Florian here, which is talking about plants as living beings. Obviously, plants are living beings, but I think what he's kind of hinting at here is the idea of sentience and consciousness and those sorts of things. Obviously, we're very familiar with humans and animals, and my dog, wherever she is, being sentient and being able to kind of understand and communicate. But am I right in thinking the plants are actually much more similar to animals than we think? They just do it on a much longer time scale, as I was sort of hinting at from watching David Attenborough, or do you think they are more? Yeah, because you sort of. It's interesting when we talk about plants. When you were talking about plants, you said things like, "Oh, the plant wants water," or "The plant wants to do this." But to what extent does the plant want anything, and to what extent is it just a series of chemical processes going on in cells?
Yeah, so I will say two things. Certainly, I use that language. I often also try to say that it's a molecular decision, right? Which means it's based on genes and proteins. And so I think that there's certainly a problem with us trying to impose our understanding of whatness from a mammalian perspective onto plants and vice versa. But I do think that we also, I always get myself into trouble with this, but I'm such a truth teller. I think we also over elevate how many of our behaviors are a series of chemical reactions or not as well. And so certainly some of the things that we do are about free will and other things, but I think sometimes we overestimate what our behaviors are about and underestimate or try to impose our human definitions of what behaviors about or on plants. And so I am personally pretty agnostic about using the term intelligence or sentience about plants. What fascinates me more about that is that there are some people who insist that plants are intelligent, and there are some people who insist that they are not. And I believe that the insisting one way or the other tells us so much more about us as humans and our human nature than it does about the plants, that I get fascinated with that as opposed to getting taken in on one side of the argument or the other. Because for me, it all depends on how you define a word. If you define intelligence as awareness of the environment that you're in and behaviors resulting from that awareness, plants are aware and they behave in response to that. But if intelligence to you is about morals as we understand human morals, it's about value systems as we understand human value systems, then they are not. And so to me, it's so much about how you define it. And I am completely okay with understanding that there is a form of plant intelligence or awareness that is different from human intelligence or awareness. And for me, I decided very early that plants are fascinating and interesting in and of themselves, not for the ways in which we can make parallels to our human or mammalian life on the planet.
Wow, I think that's a fantastic answer. And it's, yeah, I think you're right. It's one of those examples in the history of science. I think the steam engine is one of these, and I think maybe deciding what to send on the Voyager probe was another one where we learned more about ourselves from the thing. So the steam engine taught us more about thermodynamics than we actually knew before. And similarly, the sending the golden record and everything off into space was more interesting about what we thought about ourselves than it was for sending a bit of metal into space, I think. So yeah, I do always find these discussions in science absolutely fascinating.
If I might say, I often also too have flights of fancy where I imagine other organisms on the planet looking at us and saying these humans believe that they're so aware, they believe they're so intelligent, and yet look at climate change. Look at what they're doing to their own environment. So the plants may actually be mocking our intelligence or questioning our intelligence because the choices we're making are making our own life more difficult in the space we have to live. And so I think I believe that maybe that's one of the reasons I believe we need to be looking to the plants for lessons.
And that's what Lawrence was saying. So one could argue that plants have knowledge. Could they be said to know things? And I think this is almost putting our human view of knowledge and knowing and whatever onto a plant, which knows lots of things like how to germinate or how to photosynthesize and many other things. Yes. But what does knowing mean in that sense? I think you just get very philosophical.
What does knowing mean? For me, if knowing is awareness and ability to respond, plants know. But we don't like to say they know because they know differently than we know. So.
That's a very succinct way of putting it. So I'll move on to a few of the other questions that have been coming in. It's a few sort of slightly random ones, but I'm going to put them to you anyway. So Fred asks, what is the most successful plant in your opinion? And that's probably I guess how you define success.
Yes. Yeah. I think that in terms of, it's hard to say most successful because some people would look at that through an evolutionary lens and look at which plant has persisted the longest. But then as, I think about as a part of climate change, unfortunately, we're seeing in some areas melting of ice and other things. And there are seeds that are full to recover from that. So is that the most successful because you were able to persist for the longest? So I think it depends a little bit on how you think about success, because any plant that's able to exist in its local environment and produce the next generation, that's successful. But it's a question if you're thinking about long-term success and how many generations and millennia they're able to do that or not. So
interesting. Alejandra was also asking, in terms of the lessons we can learn from plants, what do plants teach us about accepting loss? Are we part of a bigger wisdom that plants remind us of?
Yeah, so one of the lessons, most plant biologists probably wouldn't think of it immediately as a lesson for loss, but one of the lessons that I think of as a lesson for loss is that some plants, if they're in an environment that it's pretty clear that the environment is harsh in some ways or lacking something in some ways, they will flower much earlier than they would have if conditions had been better. And in so doing, they produce many fewer seeds. So they lose the ability to really produce a full generation because they've made a decision that I need to produce some seeds as opposed to miss a chance to produce any seeds. And so to me, that's a sense of loss. But to me, it's also wisdom, right? And so I think about that. I've thought about that a lot over the pandemic because I made a decision. I really was sheltered at home. So I lost a lot of time with relatives. I lost a lot of time with friends, but I lost that time in the hopes that things would be better afterwards. And I think there are some cases where plants lose some of their reproduction potential because they accelerate their life cycle if things aren't looking well. So I think of that as a lesson in loss, but I also think I see things through a very different lens. Most plant biologists probably would say there are no lessons on loss. But I also, even annually, the dropping of leaves in fall, the plants are losing leaves so that they can reduce the load that they have to care for energetically, right? Because energy is going to reduce. So to me, those are also lessons in wisdom. Sometimes you have to lose part of yourself to be able to persist for longer. So I do think that there are some lessons on loss that emerge from natural contexts, including plants.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. It's almost like plants are kind of constantly making kind of cost benefit analysis of going, well, if it's going to be this bad, absolutely. I'm going to have to like how can I, they're always like thinking, how can I maximize my lifespan? How can I do this? And they're not afraid to make tough decisions like getting rid of all the leaves or flowering early. Which is you're just kind of thinking of plants as sort of very hard-nosed pragmatists when it comes to survival. There's a few questions here, like more on the kind of ecology side. Garth was asking about rewilding. He was saying, should human society be rewilded in the sense that the environmentalists are encouraging for a green recovery? I know that there were these sort of viral images, some of which were fake, I think, at the start of the pandemic, where it was sort of saying, look, 2 months into it, look how the everything's blooming now that humans aren't around, which I think a few of them kind of played into a narrative we wanted to believe. But do you think there is a place for kind of rewilding and bringing back some of those space? I know in the UK, certainly, we're being encouraged to plant flowers for bees to make sure that bees have enough places to get their pollen from. So are there any similar movements in the US to kind of rewild areas?
Yeah, so we've certainly had the bee movement for a number of years. There has been, I think about it because I've heard so much about it in higher education. Many higher education campuses have been reintroducing green spaces onto campus, and many cities, I think, have been reintroducing green spaces. So that's not necessarily rewilding, but it is a kind of pushing back on this kind of we need to be in natural context. I think more than it having long-term, certainly there are some long-term ecological implications from that. I think the biggest outcome of those kind of interventions goes back to something we were talking about when we first started the question session. Those are great ways to get humans rethinking what our relationship is with plants and the importance of plants in our life. And so I think that those have been the best outcomes from those kinds of interventions in my estimation.
Excellent. And also a question about invasive species. I think you mentioned at some point. So do invasive species eventually come under environmental control? I mean, at some point, once a species is in an environment, you sort of, it's there and you can't eradicate it without, spending an absurd amount of money and resources. So presumably they then just become part of an ecosystem and then sort of are controlled in normal ways. Populations of species are controlled in environments displacing native species, I guess.
In many cases, although there are some, so I'm originally from the southern part of the US, from Arkansas, and in Arkansas, Georgia, and other states, there's some invasive species that have just kudzu that have taken over complete spaces and in fact are causing structural damage because they grow on buildings and between the cracks of bricks and such. So in some cases, depending on the invasive species, certainly they set up or reestablish a kind of balance in an ecosystem and you deal with it. And there are other cases such as this where it becomes just a battle between the humans who are trying to live in that environment. And in many cases, in addition, apart from it being these structural challenges, this particular plant has just outgrown so many of the other species that it's shifted things, which then affect the insects, right? We were talking about rewilding for bees. And so I think part of the issue is when invasive species have such a broad impact on the ecology that they also start to infect the invertebrate, insect, and other aspects of the ecosystem. And part of our challenge has been, how do we deal with them in ways that are sustainable? So in a lot of cases, people are trying to figure out, well, can you use those plants for making fiber or paper or in some other way, so that while you're dealing with the problem it's proposed, you're creating a solution in another case, as opposed to just creating a big pool of something that you have to kill and dispose of. And I think those are the real challenges that we have to face, because it's intricate to think about those. And those are big multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary problems that you have to get sociologists, psychologists, and scientists and others working on. And sometimes we struggle with how to do that effectively and efficiently.
It just, you reminded me there of the old lady who swallowed a fly, who then obviously swallows a succession of larger and larger animals to try and deal with the previous animal she swallows. And that sort of reminds me of, adding in one invasive species to deal with the other invasive species. Yeah. And you just, you end up like the poor woman in the song, I think.
Yes.
So there are a few people who've been doing their homework and looking at your research area. And I believe I'm right in saying that part of your research looks at photosynthesis and light and plants' response to light. So Irene and I think Florian were both asking questions about that. So both questions were kind of around the same thing, which is the kind of frequencies of light that plants respond to compared with humans. In humans, we've got, I think, 3 receptors in our eye that are sort of 3 different colors that allow us to kind of picture the world. Do plants see, in inverted commas, the whole full spectrum, or is it sort of particular frequencies that react with the chlorophyll or cause photosynthesis? I guess. I was just going to say, and Florian also adds an additional question, which I'll tack on to the end, which is that he recalls hearing that a photoreceptor is one of the rare genes that jumped from plants to animals. Is that true, or is that somehow misremembered?
Yes. No. So one of the photoreceptors that I mentioned, one of the blue light photoreceptors, cryptochromes, is found across plants and animal kingdom, all the way into bacteria, actually. Wow. So no, that he's very much correct in that regard. But plants are, from what we've been able to detect, most plants can see pretty much all the visible spectrum except yellow. Plants don't seem to perceive yellow, at least we haven't identified. So for a long time, we thought plants were able to see pretty much everything but yellow and green, because usually the color that you see is because you're not absorbing that color, right? It reflects to your eye. So you would assume that plants don't absorb green very well because they appear very green, the leaves, to us. But there actually are photoreceptors that perceive green light. So plants can perceive infrared light all the way through the visible spectrum into UV, with the exception of doing very much. They don't use yellow very much.
Fascinating. Is there not is that a sort of physical reason, or do you think that, well, I suppose if a plant that was able to use the yellow light hasn't evolved by now, that's probably a good reason that one hasn't evolved.
Yeah, well, so what we do know, what's interesting about that is that it's possible that there may be some plants that can use it. And I say that because photosynthetic cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, people are often used to that as pun scum or something like that. The chloroplasts in plants are derived from those, and photoreceptors in cyanobacteria can see all colors of light, including yellow. So there are photoreceptors in photosynthetic organisms in nature that can perceive yellow. So that would suggest that perhaps somewhere on the planet, plants may have the ability to perceive yellow, but the ones that we study most closely do not seem to do so. There's a yellow gap.
Interesting. There are a few tree fans in the chat.
Yes, I love trees.
So Alejandra says, could you share a lesson that you've learned from trees? There are a few other people asking for more tree content. So I don't know if you have anything in the book about trees that you'd like to share.
Well, I do have some things in the book about trees, particularly because of the one of the concepts I talk about are interactions and collaborations between plants and other organisms and fungi. And so trees are certainly covered in terms of the mycorrhizae, because tree roots interact with fungi for absorbing water and phosphate and such. But I'm very much fascinated with trees and talk about them in the book. And also one of the articles that I flashed by that was an American scientist last year with plants as trees and witnesses actually talks about the fascination I have with ancient trees. And so I had visited a former plantation here in the U.S. where some of my former ancestors would have been enslaved Africans here. And I'm really fascinated with the idea, it's not only true of trees, but it's particularly true of trees, that the carbon dioxide we breathe becomes a physical part of plants, right? And that's true of the plants in our environment, but in trees, it gets captured in wood in a way that for me, that means the wood is a kind of capturing a witness of the lives that live there. So I'm particularly interested in humans' interactions with long-term plant species such as trees, and what it would mean for us to really understand the ways in which our physical breath and interaction becomes a physical part of the plants in our environment. And I'm doing some, I guess you would call it sociocultural work on the edge of what I do. I keep pushing the boundaries of what I do, from biochemistry all the way into sociocultural. But yeah, I think, but trees, there's a fascinating book out right now by Susan Simmert, Finding the Mother Tree, which talks about this real interaction of fungi with the roots of trees and what that means for sustaining forests and other parts of our ecosystem. So I think trees are absolutely fascinating.
Excellent. Talking of a socio-cultural question, Fred has dropped this tough question into the chat. What plant has influenced human culture the most? That's a good question.
Oh, that is a good question. Well, it depends on where you are in the world, right? But I think about some of the globally, some plants like rice have had a huge impact because rice is a staple across much of the world, but it also became a point of one of the reasons enslaved people were brought here, were to culture rice here, right? And so I think about some of those that have this importance across the world, but it's also in later years been the target because it's such a staple food across the world. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk about golden rice, right? Where they were trying to fortify rice with vitamins to counteract blindness that is in children and other places around the world. So I think about crops like that, rice and maize, that have these real global implications in terms of communities far and wide, and communities independent of their socioeconomic status or not, that are really impacted by some of those.
Yeah, I was going to say rice. That was going to be my my call. Although, interestingly, I did look at. I just googled this. What crop is actually produced the most of per year in the world? And it wasn't. I thought it would be rice or maybe maize, but it's neither of those things. It's actually sugarcane. Which is one that I didn't expect. But
and that makes sense because sugarcane. I'm actually not surprised. One of the things that increases most as there's any kind of advancement in societies is human use of sugar, and so sugar is a huge impact globally. Yeah, interesting.
Fascinating. Yeah. I definitely would have said rice. I would have bet the house on rice. But you're right. I think an added sugar is one of those sort of hidden things that, because food that we would eat might be very processed, might have a lot of sugar added, that's sort of taking us further away from the lessons we might be learning from the plants that we're eating, I think, in some way.
Yes.
So anyway, before we go, we're kind of approaching the end of this event, but there's still loads of great chat going on and loads of great comments. I'll try and put a couple more to you before we go. So Fred just has a slightly random question, but Fred asks, why are some plants male and female and others not? There's a variety of different ways of reproducing across the plant kingdom that sort of make humans and sort of animal reproduction look quite pedestrian, I think.
So, yeah, no, it's interesting. That's a very interesting question. So last week I happened to be in a botany conference, and there was a talk by a professor, Chris Martin from Bucknell University in the US, about that. So there's such a range of gender expression in plants, and some of us know plants that produce female flowers, and he was even challenging the notion that we should use the female male flowers and that we should just call them, the seed bearing, or using some other kind of language. But certainly there's a whole range of ways that you see plants reproducing, if it's sexually, in terms of having the flowers, either some plants having both flowers that are producing the seed and producing the sperm, the anthers on the same plant, or not. And I think that we have a lot to learn from that in terms of the ways in which we have, in some cultures, reduced ourselves to understanding gender expression for humans.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, actually, as people are becoming more aware of gender issues, loads of different scientific fields trying to change their terminology and change their language to actually kind of be more accurate and not just, just saying, oh, that's male, that's female, that's male, that's female.
Well, and in some plants, it's also, you see switches depending on what the external environment or the nutrient availability is. A whole range of interesting things that can happen with plants in that regard.
And this almost feels like it's tied in with kind of decolonizing the curriculum as well. Like I sort of was talking to you before how, the scientific discipline of botany was mainly carried out in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries by people that look like me from countries like mine, going to countries all around the world and, taking samples and bringing them back and, taking local knowledge and not crediting it. And I wonder, how do you feel the field of, botany and plant biology is sort of dealing with its past and sort of facing up to some of the ways that the knowledge was, created, taken, worked out in sort of previous centuries?
I think there are some really interesting conversations happening, particularly in the science and technology society space. But I think there are always these conversations about how do you balance wanting to conserve, which is what some of the botanic gardens and others purport to do, with doing that in ways that honor culture and honor, the sources of the materials. And I think we have a lot of conversations yet to have about that. And many scientists don't even engage that. They just want to do experiments and publish papers without thinking about those cultural implications. But I think there's so much work that we still yet have to do there. And there are some current implications of that, right? In the ways in which I talked about wanting to be a biological patent lawyer, the ways in which we think about whether you can patent science or not are not completely disconnected from the voyages that used to go and just claim a particular plant. So I think that these are themes that recur in science, and we have to deal with them in one context or another, or they just keep coming back in different forms.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah, and I do like the idea of people saying, well, I just want to go and do my research, keep all the politics out of science. It's sort of like, well, politics is the reason you're here doing science and somebody else is.
Right.
So it sort of goes back to, I think, what we were talking about, the survivorship bias and the, 99% of the acorns not turning into oak trees. Klaus just asks, I think it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek question. And they say, so are there LGBTQ plants that exist? And I guess I'd say, well, there are LGBT animals across the animal kingdom, so it wouldn't surprise me if that sort of thing happened in plants. But it kind of feels like, again, mapping on a kind of human view of how we feel and know about things onto the plant world. But there are plants, like you were saying, that can kind of switch their sex. They can do all kinds of things.
There are plants that have both, what are considered male and female flowers on the same plant. Yeah, there's a whole range. Yeah.